1791. Dear and worthy parents, you cannot imagine what kind of Jews they have here in Virginia. They are all German itinerants who made a living by begging in Germany. They came to America during the war as soldiers, and now they wouldn't recognize themselves. One can make a good living here, and all live in peace. Anyone can do what he wants. There is no rabbi in all of America to issue a cherem against anyone. Rebecca Samuel.
In 1840, a Jewish immigrant from Bavaria named Abraham Rice landed in Rhode Island. He was the first ordained rabbi ever to set foot on American soil. Some months later, Rice was invited to become leader of Congregation Nidchei Yisrael in Baltimore, and was horrified by what he found there. As far back as the 1790s, some American Jews had expressed a desire to establish a unified national rabbinate in the mold of those in the Old World, bodies that would bring the community back under one law and one tradition. But they were in the minority, and by 1840, the American Jewry that Rice discovered was a nation of Sabbath breakers and Spinozists. Every synagogue prayed from a different prayer book. Women attended Shabbat services in equal numbers to men, and in some places sat alongside them. Children were not expected to keep kosher outside of the home. Young men got tattoos. Old men were given Masonic funerals in Jewish cemeteries. Intermarriage was rampant. Before the end of the decade, Rice resigned from his post in disgust, by which time many more rabbis had arrived in America, each making their own attempts to unify the community. They came from every stream of Jewish thought, and all of them would fail. Jewish immigrants were arriving from every country in which they were known to live, faster than any rabbi could hope to serve them. A new Jerusalem, a great Jewish community every bit the equal of London, Amsterdam, and Odessa, was emerging from what had previously been a tiny hamlet on the far side of the world. Within a generation, American Jews would take each other's lives in a battle for the soul of the nation. And by the time American Jewish leaders did find the strength to unite under a single set of principles, their efforts would be utterly swept aside in the face of an unprecedented new era. When we last left off, the newly independent United States was home to 2,000 Jews spread across 5 cities: New York, Philadelphia, Richmond, Charleston, and Savannah. The Jews of Rhode Island had dispersed, having mostly supported the British in the Revolutionary War. But no sooner had the war ended than the former leader of the Rhode Island synagogue, Isaac Turo, died, leading his pro-revolutionary wife and children to return and settle in Boston with some in-laws. In 1830, a proper Jewish community was established there with the arrival of refugees fleeing the French invasion of Algeria. But by that time, Turo's eldest son Judah had long since become a shopkeeper in New Orleans. When he first arrived in 1800, Louisiana was still part of the Spanish Empire, where Jews were forbidden. But following its annexation to the U.S. just 3 years later, Turo helped establish a Jewish community there. This is a typical illustration of Jewish America in the early 19th century, gradually expanding, but still few in number and limited to a handful of communities. Over the course of this period, some Jews did immigrate to the U.S., but these were overwhelmingly Caribbean and North African Jews who already had family ties to America. So too did Jews continue to face some legal inequalities. While the U.S. Constitution ensured the free exercise of religion and prohibited religious tests for federal office, the legal consensus of the time was that these laws didn't apply to states. In 1820, 7 U.S. states still barred non-Christians from public office. But if change was slow to reach American Jews from without, there were enormous changes going on within, and none more so than the proliferation of the Hamburg-based Reform movement. Faced with increasing assimilation and intermarriage, many American synagogues began looking for ways to impose some measure of religious order, often making congregations less democratic and more exclusionary. These were the circumstances under which the Charleston newspaper editor Isaac Harvey and several local Jewish families boycotted the city's main synagogue, Bet Elohim, and established the Reformed Society of Israelites, which not only introduced Reform Judaism to the Americas, but also gave the movement its name. Sure enough, by 1830, Bet Elohim gave in to the Reformed Society's demands and became the first Reformed synagogue in the New World. By mid-century, the majority of American synagogues had joined the Reform movement. Though it originated in Europe, Reform Judaism was exceptionally well suited to the way Judaism was already being practiced in the United States, and it's probably worth discussing why. In my video on colonial America, I noted that there were no rabbis in what became the United States until the 19th century, but that was only a symptom. Even in 1830, the Jewish population of the US was only around 6,000. Being so few in number across such a large area for such a long time, strict adherence to Jewish law outside the confines of the home or the synagogue was simply logistically impossible. So a distinctly Jewish American tradition had emerged, which rejected religious observance in the day-to-day as a practicality, but resolutely upheld the traditions of Jewish holidays and life events. Only when Jewish immigrants began arriving in much larger numbers in the 1840s did the first rabbis appear on the continent to grapple with this unfamiliar American Judaism. Throughout that decade, increasingly conservative and religious rule in Bavaria led tens of thousands of Bavarian liberals, including Jews, to emigrate to the US, one of whom happened to be Abraham Rice, the first American rabbi. A subscriber to the modern Orthodox movement, Rice was unhappy with the general absence of religious observance, blaming it for the widespread assimilation of the time. More than a quarter of American Jews at this time had a Gentile spouse, a rate that wouldn't be achieved again until the 1990s. The first Jewish member of the House of Representatives was a leading figure in the anti-immigrant Know Nothing Party, who campaigned in support of mandatory Protestant prayer in public schools and led a riot against Irish immigrants in Philadelphia. The first Jewish senator converted to Christianity almost immediately after taking office, and frankly, good riddance. But Rice's congregants in Baltimore did not agree that this assimilation was the result of religious laxity, and in general had no interest whatsoever in returning to orthodoxy. From this point onward, Orthodox synagogues were frequently established alongside Reform ones, but they were always in the minority, and often struggled. Meanwhile, the second and third rabbis to arrive in the US not only embraced the American style of Judaism, but saw it as a model for modernizing Jewish practice back in Europe. In 1847, Rabbis Isaac Mayer Wise of Albany and Max Lilienthal of New York established an ad hoc American rabbinate, with the goal of formally uniting American Judaism under the Reform banner. In the 1850s, Wise and Lilienthal's work brought them both to Cincinnati, one of many Western cities now taking in entire villages' worth of Bavarian Jewish immigrants. After a decade of work, their attempt at a universal prayer book, Minhag America, caught on in many of the new Western communities, but struggled to gain traction in the more established synagogues of the East Coast. In part, the Eastern opposition came from Reform Jews who felt that Lilienthal and Wise's reforms weren't radical enough, but most of it came down to a desire by American synagogues to maintain their independence. Having spent 2 centuries without rabbis, the United States had no Jewish court system whatsoever. Each synagogue was its own supreme authority. And even among congregations that sympathized with the Reform movement, or even adopted Minhag America as their prayer book, there was no appetite to change that. Even most of the new immigrants fueling the work of Minhag America in Cincinnati saw the ability to pick and choose from a diverse array of independent synagogues as a feature. And just a quick note, isn't it interesting that this was all coming out of Cincinnati? Even at a time when Manhattan alone accounted for 1/3 of American Jews, all of the important developments were happening out in the provinces. And while Cincinnati was rising to prominence as the center of Jewish thought, another, even newer, even Westerner city was rising to become the first great center of American Jewish culture. In 1848, the Mexican-American War ended with Mexico ceding New Mexico and Greater California to the United States. ending California's fourth and final struggle for national independence. However, even before the treaty ending the war was signed, gold was discovered in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, leading to an unprecedented rush of new arrivals. Many came from the eastern US, but almost as many came from abroad. This included a surprisingly large number of Jews. Just 4 years into its existence as a city, San Francisco had the fourth largest Jewish community in the US, and the largest as a percentage of population at about 10%. Now, most people who came to California in the gold rush were not going out looking for gold themselves. If they were, they wouldn't have lived in San Francisco. But there was a 100% chance that some people would strike it rich, and those people would need basic goods and services, like blue jeans, and department stores, and civil engineers, and eccentric homeless men who were actually important civil rights leaders. Even brothels had a premium on Jewish prostitutes, especially if they were natural redheads. Jewish businesses like these represented only a modest portion of activity in the city, but they put Jewish figures on a level of importance that the community had never enjoyed in America before, which only made the city more attractive, and also helped prevent it from going bust when the gold rush ended. By 1880, San Francisco's Jewish population was second only to New York City. Max Lilienthal may have been a Cincinnati icon, but his kids were San Francisco icons. And ultimately, it was no less of a center for Jewish thought. In 1893, it was a point of pride that a California girl was being courted to become the first female rabbi in the Americas. And to this day, the great synagogue of She'erit Yisrael features a stained glass window of Moses bringing down the Ten Commandments at Yosemite. Now, it's worth noting that the California Gold Rush was entirely coincidental to its annexation into the United States. The entire purpose of the Mexican-American War had been to extend the southern sector of the country in order to facilitate the expansion of slavery, which anti-war politicians were quick to point out. The gold rush was no innocent thing, but it completely blew up this plan. Many of the so-called 49ers who settled during the gold rush were in fact 48ers, revolutionaries who had fled the suppression of liberal and nationalist uprisings in Europe. The only group of Americans more hostile to the institution of slavery were in New England, and once California was admitted as a free state in 1850, the clock began ticking toward civil war. To Rabbi Max Lilienthal. Sir, since you have discarded the Lord and taken up the sword in defense of a Negro government, your picture, which has occupied a place in our southern homes, we herewith return, that you may present them to your beloved black friends, as they will not be permitted in our dwellings. Your veneration for the Star-Spangled Banner is, I presume, in your pockets, like all other demagogues who left their country for their country's good. I shall be engaged actively in the field, and shall be happy to rid Israel of the disgrace of your life. Be assured that we have memories, and our friends we shall not forget. Jacob A. Cohen, New Orleans, the 28th of July, 1861. Modern-day Confederate sympathizers, at least those who were not themselves anti-Semites, sometimes like to uphold the Confederacy as a supposed defender of American Jews in contrast to an anti-Semitic union. For the most part, this is self-serving nonsense, and it rests on 3 anecdotes from the war. The first is that, for the first year of the war, the United States explicitly prohibited non-Christians from serving as chaplains in the Army and Navy while the Confederacy didn't. This essentially boils down to the uncomfortable truth that the capital A brand name abolitionist movement was dominated by a certain brand of evangelical Christianity that was deeply anti-Semitic, as well as anti-Catholic and anti-Unitarian. There was no shortage of Jewish anti-slavery activists, including Emperor Norton or Wise and Lilienthal, by then the most renowned rabbis in America. But few, if any of them, would have called themselves abolitionists due to the association. This sentiment was not absent from government, and while efforts to establish Christianity as the state religion floundered in Congress, the chaplaincy regulation was an internal matter for the Department of War and didn't need congressional approval. But this only lasted for a year. After being rejected for the post of chaplain, Rabbi Arnold Fischel of New York was given an audience with President Lincoln, who got Congress to explicitly allow non-Christian chaplains in the 1862 Militia Act. The second argument is that the Confederacy had a Jewish cabinet minister, Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin, while the Union had none. But really, this is the exception that proves the rule, and it ignores a major shift in the Jewish American landscape. At the time of independence, American Jews, like the U.S. population itself, were basically evenly split between the North and South. But also, like the general population, that had changed completely by the time of the Civil War, with the Union now being home to 89% of American Jews. Of the at least 10,000 American Jews who fought in the war, 7,000 fought for the Union. In Chicago, 100 Jewish men formed Company C of the 82nd Illinois Infantry Regiment, seeing action most notably at Gettysburg and on Sherman's March. Because of this enthusiasm, Northern Jews were also much more likely to become officers, so while the highest-ranking Jew in the Confederate Army was a colonel, the Union had 21 Jewish colonels and 2 brigadiers. The third argument cites what is probably the most notorious incident in the Jewish history of the war. By December of 1862, U.S. forces had begun closing in on control of the Mississippi River, dividing the Confederacy in two. However, the Army of the Mississippi was facing a problem of smugglers bringing Southern products across enemy lines. General Ulysses S. Grant feared that the smugglers were using profits from his soldiers to fund Confederate military operations, though in reality many of the smugglers were his own officers and even his own father. But a small percentage of smugglers originated from the local Jewish population, and believing them to be far more visible due to their names and presumed stereotypical mannerisms, Grant issued General Order No. 11, officially expelling all Jews from the territories under the Military Department of Tennessee. To this day, it remains the only edict of expulsion issued against Jews in the Americas. However, this order was met with an enormous and immediate backlash, first by Grant's own executive officers and then in Washington. This order didn't just apply to the Confederacy. In fact, it was never applied to the Confederacy. The only place where the order was actually carried out was Paducah, Kentucky, a river town in a Union state on the border with Illinois, far from the field of battle. One Jewish resident, Caesar Caskell, immediately took it upon himself to go to Washington and speak to President Lincoln directly, joined by Ohio Congressman John Gurley and Rabbis Wise and Lilienthal. Lincoln needed no convincing, and ordered General-in-Chief Henry Halleck to overturn Grant's order. But the fallout didn't end there. As much as Grant's order had revealed the true prevalence of anti-Semitism in the US, the war itself was rapidly reshaping public attitudes against that kind of behavior, even more so than in some later periods of American history. The order haunted Grant after the war, to the point of being a major issue during his 1868 presidential campaign. Not only did he make a public apology, very unusual for the time, but upon winning the presidency, he appointed more Jews to public office than all presidents before him combined. For instance, General Edward Selig Salomon, the so-called Saladin of Gettysburg, was made governor of the Washington Territory. Grant also spoke out publicly against the systematic persecution of Jews in Romania and the Russian Empire, attended the dedication of Washington, D.C.'s second synagogue, Adas Yisrael, and vehemently rejected calls from within his party to proclaim the U.S. as a Christian nation. Under Grant's administration, the last state-level bans on Jews in elected office were abolished, finally removing the United States asterisk from the list of emancipations. By the end of his presidency in 1877, Jewish equality was intrinsically linked in the public mind to American ideals of citizenship and human rights, and American anti-Semitism reached a low point that wouldn't be seen again until the 1960s. Ironically, the one part of America where anti-Semitism did increase under Grant's administration was the South. According to Rabbi Myron Berman, this undercurrent had always been present in the South, but losing the war brought it out to an extent never before seen. Southern Jewish politicians became almost non-existent for over a century after the war, while Christian politicians of Jewish descent mostly embraced post-war Reconstruction and civil rights for African Americans, making them an attractive scapegoat to groups like the White League and the Ku Klux Klan, who saw black citizens themselves as too mentally inferior to be the architects of an imagined racial insurrection that was used to fuel actual insurrection during Reconstruction. The myth of the Confederacy as a unique haven for Jews largely originates with Jewish Confederate veterans like Moses Jacob Ezekiel, who not coincidentally went on to make a career sculpting Confederate monuments, as well as one of his largest patrons, the Hebrew Ladies Memorial Association, a kind of Jewish version of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The HLMA were very eager to align the lost cause with Jewish persecution at the hands of an anti-Semitic North, and casually dismissed the contributions of the vast northern Jewish majority on the grounds of their status as immigrants or the children of immigrants. Which, f*** you. And just to add insult to injury, Ezekiel aided this effort from the comfort of exile in Rome, where his fellow Jews were still confined to the ghetto and treated as the Pope's personal property, while he lived freely and luxuriously as a foreign citizen of the country he betrayed. So, checkmate, Benjaminites! But the Civil War transformed the US in ways that went far beyond the purely military or political. With most of its southern members absent during the war, Congress was able to push through a massive backlog of programs to modernize American finance, transport, education, and immigration. Most of these policy changes were made in service of the war, but they'd been in talks long before and had an even bigger impact after. This is important for two reasons. One, the US came directly out of a civil war into an economic boom, which basically never happens, and indirectly resulted in the explosion in popularity of entertainment and recreational activities like baseball, leading to the first genuine Jewish American celebrity. Lip Pike of Brooklyn, New York, got his start with his hometown Atlantics the moment the war ended, during the truncated 1865 season. The next year with the Philadelphia Athletics, he hit 5 home runs in a single game, which was more than any other player at the time hit in an entire season. Following the establishment of the National League, he continued his slugging while also periodically managing, one of only 7 Jewish Major League managers ever and only 2 player managers. More than anyone else in this period, Pike represented the future of Jewish America. For children of immigrants like him, baseball was already becoming one of the major pathways toward acceptance at the heart of American culture, and it still is. Pike died tragically young in 1893, so he never lived to see any of the later Jewish legends of the sport, but he definitely lived long enough to know that they were coming. Secondly, the massive expansion of railways and telegraph lines that began during the war meant America was now more connected than ever. By 1869, the travel time between New York and San Francisco had been cut from 51 days to just 4, and messages could be sent instantaneously, not just across the country, but even across the Atlantic. And this had serious impacts on the character of American Judaism. The dream of Minhag America had never seemed more attainable. But just as this was happening, Rabbis Wise and Lilienthal found themselves outflanked by even more extreme reformers than themselves. Like them, Rabbi David Einhorn had been one of the loudest voices against slavery during the Civil War. Einhorn was, however, quite a bit older than Wise or Lilienthal, and had come to the US quite a bit later. So not only did he have a lot more experience as a rabbi in the Old World, but he'd been through a lot of changes in European Reform Judaism that Wise and Lilienthal simply hadn't. Minhag America was essentially based on the form of Jewish practice observed in the Hamburg Temple, which had famously walked back a lot of its more experimental changes and was quickly eclipsed by a new generation of reformers like Abraham Geiger. Einhorn was an extreme Geigerite, which is to say he was an assimilationist. His English prayer book Olat Tamid got rid of almost everything distinctly Jewish. No more priestly privileges, no more hopes for the temple, no more ritual divorce, no more kashrut, and even Shabbat services on Sundays instead of Saturdays. Such rituals were widely dismissed by Einhorn and his allies as kitchen Judaism. You know, the superstitions of women. By 1869, almost all American synagogues were Reform, but now there was a new division between classical Reform and radical Reform. Very quickly, Wise and Lilienthal tried to establish entrenched institutions that would strengthen their version of Reform Judaism: the Union of American Hebrew Congregations and Hebrew Union College, both located in Cincinnati. But even those institutions quickly became dominated by the radicals. Even Wise himself came to embrace the term Kitchen Judaism. This all came to a head in July of 1883, when Hebrew Union College's first graduating class held a celebratory banquet alongside several visiting rabbis and local dignitaries at Cincinnati's Highland House, whose menu included both meat and dairy-based dishes, as well as courses containing clams, crabs, and shrimp. This wasn't like finding a catfish barb in your perch. These were very obvious violations of kashrut. Though many of the more traditional attendees were outraged, news of the so-called Treffa banquet only leaked to the public 2 weeks later, when 23-year-old Henrietta Zold of Baltimore recalled her experience of the event in her anonymous column in the Jewish Messenger.
I would be outraging my own feelings were I to admit recording the indignation which was felt by a surprisingly small minority at the manner in which the banquet was served. There was no regard paid to our dietary laws, and consequently, 2 rabbis left the table without having touched the dishes. And I am happy to state that I know of at least 3 more who ate nothing and were indignant but signified their disapproval in a less demonstrative manner.
After initially denying any awareness of the menu, Rabbi Wise admitted that he had approved it, if only out of indifference rather than trying to make a point. But that was significant in itself. The Jewish American tradition that had emerged organically from colonial times revered the keeping of Jewish traditions in the home and synagogue just as strongly as it dispensed with them in the wider world, a principle sometimes called select kashrut. This was something else, and it deeply alienated more conservative leaders like Philadelphia's Sabato Morais and New York's Henry Pereira Mendez, who retaliated by co-founding the Conservative Jewish Theological Seminary to compete against Hebrew Union College. Mendez and Henrietta Zold, by the way, became early devotees of Moses Hess around this time, and would go on to become the first American Zionists. By this time, both Lilienthal and Einhorn had passed away, but in a last-ditch attempt to reconcile the classical reformers, radical reformers, and conservatives, Einhorn's son-in-law, Rabbi Kaufman Kohler, organized another meeting of American rabbis in Pittsburgh in 1885 to put together a platform for all of American Reform Judaism going forward. 1. Judaism is not the one true religion for all people, but it is ours. 2. The biblical story of creation is not literal and does not contradict evolution. 3. American Judaism shall embrace the moral laws of halacha and retain communal celebrations, but reject all other rituals. 4. Jewish ritual law has no place in the modern world and hinders rather than aids Jewish spirituality. 5. American Jews shall no longer constitute a nation, but only one of many religious communities, and shall reject all aspirations to restore a temple or a national home in Palestine. 6. Judaism extends a hand in friendship to Christianity and Islam as Abrahamic brethren. 7. Judaism does not recognize Christian concepts of heaven or hell. 8. Judaism calls upon the community in modern times to rectify the suffering of the poor. As you may notice, this wasn't actually a compromise. Most of the clauses aren't controversial in Judaism at all, but the ones that are, really are. The wholesale rejections of ritual tradition and Jewish nationhood were complete giveaways to the radicals, which alienated most everyone else. In his excellent chronicle American Judaism, historian Jonathan Sarna cites the Pittsburgh Platform as a turning point, which set the course for Jewish practice in the U.S. forever after. And I can see that in certain areas, like the embrace of economic justice as a particularly Jewish value. But taken as a whole, I couldn't disagree more. For one, the platform was never actually adopted by any Jewish organization. On the most fundamental level, Rabbi Kohler had failed. The radicals would continue to champion assimilation until their self-imposed dissolution in 1937, after which classical reform not only won out, but progressively embraced more and more of the old traditions. But this kind of esoteric synagogue politics paled in comparison to the new challenge facing American Jewry at that particular moment. In order to meet the demand for industrial workers during the Civil War, the Lincoln administration had passed the 1864 Immigration Act, which massively increased the federal government's ability to process new immigrants, expanded their abilities to secure work and housing, and created a clear and quick path to citizenship. But only in the 1880s were the full consequences of this law becoming clear, and the response of many American Jewish leaders was fear. At the time of the Pittsburgh Platform, the U.S. had a total Jewish population of about 300,000. By the end of the century, it was over 1 million, and by 1914, it was almost 3 million. Events on the other side of the Atlantic were about to give rise to the largest migration in Jewish history, more than 10 times the number who fled from Spain to the Ottoman Empire 4 centuries earlier. And these were not educated, middle-class Reform Jews from Western Europe. The American way of Judaism that had emerged from the colonial era didn't need to be codified. As it turned out, it couldn't be codified. And in spite of everything that was coming, it would survive. But everything else was about to change, and not a moment too soon. Special thanks to my patrons, including Matthew Von Abo, Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskind, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Oshel Gordon, Serhiy Herasimov, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, and Eric Liederman.